It was a cold November evening, the kind that smelled faintly of wet leaves and cooling brick. The living room light flickered again, that same stubborn bulb I'd meant to change for weeks, throwing uneven patches of yellow across the walls. My home used to feel warm under that light. Now it felt like an interrogation room. Emily stood on the staircase, her voice slicing through the air like broken glass. "You either pay rent this month, or you can sleep in the street like the rest of them." The words hit harder than I expected. I just stood there, halfway between the kitchen and the sitting room, gripping the edge of the counter to steady my hand. Patrick was by the door, head bent over his phone, pretending to read something. His silence was heavier than her shouting. "Rent?" I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. "In my own house, Emily?" She rolled her eyes and shifted her weight on the step. "It's our house now, Henry. Things change. We've got bills to cover. You've had your time." Her tone, sharp, detached, echoed off the framed photos lining the hallway. Margaret's smile stared back at me from one of them, soft and frozen in time, as if she were watching the entire scene unfold. The kettle began to whistle, shrill and insistent, filling the silence no one wanted to break. Steam curled up behind Emily's words, catching the dim light like ghostly smoke. She didn't even flinch. Patrick stayed glued to his screen. "You hear me?" she said, stepping down 2 stairs. "We're not running a charity here." Her hand was on the banister, nails polished a bright wine red. That color always looked wrong in this house, too loud against the muted tones Margaret loved. My wife had chosen everything here with care. The beige curtains, the oak table, the floral teacups I'd promised never to throw out. I could still see her handwriting on the jar labeled sugar. "I hear you," I said. My hands shook slightly as I reached to turn off the kettle. "But you're mistaken if you think this house ever stopped being mine." Patrick finally looked up, his mouth opening, then closing again. "Dad, let's not—" Emily cut him off with a raised hand. "Patrick, please. We've discussed this. He needs to contribute or what?" I asked, setting the teapot down harder than I meant to. "You'll toss me out? Onto my own porch?" Her eyes flashed, a spark of irritation rather than guilt. "Don't twist my words. It's about fairness. You've been living here without paying for anything. We've been covering utilities, groceries." I almost laughed. Utilities. The word sounded like a boardroom term, sterile and transactional. I leaned against the counter, studying the two of them. My son's jaw tightened, that same nervous habit he had as a boy when he knew he'd done wrong. "Patrick," I said softly, "you still have that scar on your hand from when you helped me paint this wall, remember?" He looked away. Emily sighed. "This isn't about nostalgia, Henry. We're adults with responsibilities. You're retired. You can afford a little rent." A low rumble of thunder rolled outside, faint but close. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows like a metronome for her cruelty. For a long moment, none of us spoke. I could smell the faint bitterness of the overboiled tea. The clock above the mantel ticked, steady, mechanical. Time, it seemed, was the only thing still on my side. I poured myself a cup, ignoring how my hands trembled slightly. The spoon clinked against porcelain as I stirred. The sound was absurdly loud in the silence. Emily crossed her arms, exhaling impatiently. "So, what's it going to be, Henry?" "Rent or—" I looked up at her then, meeting her eyes for the first time since she'd started. They were bright, almost daring me to argue. "Or the street?" I finished for her. Patrick finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "She didn't mean it like that." "She meant it exactly like that," I said, taking a slow sip. The tea burned my tongue, but I didn't flinch. "And I'll remember it." Emily laughed softly, a small exhale of disbelief. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said. "You'll know when I'm being dramatic." Something in my tone, calm, low, final, made her pause. Her lips parted slightly, as if to say more, but she didn't. The house seemed to hold its breath with us. I glanced toward the window. The streetlights outside shimmered in the rain, their glow broken by water running down the glass. My reflection looked tired, older than I felt that morning. That was the moment it sank in. Not the words, not the insult, but the realization that this house no longer felt like mine. The furniture, the walls, the laughter, All of it now belonged to their version of home. "All right, Emily," I said at last, setting my cup down gently. "We'll see about that." I walked toward the hallway, past the family photos she hadn't yet replaced. Margaret's picture caught my eye again, her soft smile, the faint curve of her lips that always meant "don't lower yourself." Henry. The rain outside grew steadier, louder, until it drowned out the rest of their whispers. I went to my room, closing the door behind me with care. My hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from something sharper, humiliation simmering beneath calm. Through the thin wall, I could hear Emily still talking, her voice muffled, Patrick's tone defensive, apologetic. None of it mattered. That night, as I sat in the dark, listening to the rain, one truth echoed in my mind. This house had changed, but so had I. And sooner or later they'd see what that meant. I used to think a house was a collection of things, nails, boards, a roof that kept the rain out. After Margaret died, I learned it was the small ordinances of ordinary life that made it a home, where she hung the curtains each spring, how she left the sugar jar with a pencil-scrawled label, the exact spot by the sink where she kept the lemon-scented dishcloth. We'd lived in that two-story on Maple Drive in Burlington County for 34 years. 34 years of quiet Tuesday nights, of Saturday paint jobs and Sunday coffee at the diner with the same chipped mug. It was our geography. It was where I learned how to be a husband, when we first bought the place. The mortgage was a mountain, $112,000, a figure that felt monstrous in 1989 when I signed the papers at the county clerk's office. I remember the ink smudging under my thumb. I was a postal supervisor then, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the smell of paper and rubber stamps always in my nostrils. Margaret joked that I loved the smell of mail more than I loved her, and I pretended to be offended. We framed our first mortgage statement and joked about anniversary rituals. We painted the living room twice, once because the color didn't suit, a second time because we could. When she died, heart failure, sudden and merciless 5 years ago, the house didn't change on the outside. The oak tree still dropped leaves in October. The mailbox still dented when the mail truck backed up too close. But inside, every cabinet and corner held a little echo of her, the faint ghost of her perfume in the linen drawer, the threadbare shawl on the back of the chair she always forgot to take off. I kept busy with work they call unimportant, but which healed me in ways I couldn't name. Sanding the porch railings until my knuckles bled, mowing the lawn until the neighbors complimented the stripes, repainting the mailbox that had rusted near the hinge. Maintenance became what grief couldn't be, a task that returned me to myself. Patrick was 27 when Margaret passed. He'd been my bright, awkward boy who fixed the porch light at dusk and pretended to know about vinyl records. After college, he chased a marketing startup like a comet. Late nights, investor pitches, the kind of optimism that made me both proud and anxious. The venture died the way most small comets do. He was left with a lease, a bruised bank account, and a humility he hadn't had before. 2 years ago, when he and Emily lost their apartment after a landlord dispute and a string of unpaid invoices, I told them the upstairs rooms were theirs. I said it the way I'd said everything important in that house, simply with the light making the same shadows on the floorboards, and no fanfare. "It's only temporary," I told them, "until you find your feet." Patrick's voice cracked when he said, "Thanks, Dad." He hugged me, like it might make everything right again. I believed him. I believed Emily when she smiled too, a practiced, polished smile that at first I took for kindness. She was an event planner. Her quick hands and quicker laugh seemed made for organizing other people's lives. She talked about themes and decor, about brand identity and Instagram aesthetics. I listened to her stories the way I listened to the radio, occasionally interested, mostly comforted by the hum. At first, she corrected me like someone correcting a recipe. "It's not dinner, Henry. It's supper," she would say lightly while folding napkins with precision. I would laugh and tell her Margaret used to insist on dinner at 6, sharp. "Old Margaret," I'd say. Emily would pat my shoulder as if I were a pleasant anachronism. I liked the sound of my son's house filled with voices. I liked someone to call me from the upstairs while I was tinkering in the garage. The house felt briefly the way it had when it first had its new paint, bright and alive. Routine is the quiet architecture of trust. For 2 years, my days were the small work of a retired man. The Saturday crossword at the table, the Tuesday trip to the post office to see old colleagues, the Thursday call with Social Security about direct deposit. I had my checks, modest and regular, a retirement figure that paid the utilities and groceries and the occasional lunch at the diner. I'd never liked asking for money, not even from Margaret when we had arguments about carpet or curtains. Pride is a soft thing until it's sharpened by need. Then the conversation started to change. It was minor at first, a rearranged photo here, a plant moved there. The first time Emily replaced a family picture with a framed abstract, she said, "It'll modernize the place." I didn't argue. I told myself it was nothing, that marble countertops and candles didn't make a man forget his wife. Once, over coffee, Patrick asked if I would mind transferring the electricity account into their name. "It makes taxes cleaner," he said. I helped him without thinking, scribbling my signature on a form that promised convenience. He took my pen and laughed, the way he had taken the last slice of pie when he was a boy, with confidence. I trusted him. Later, Emily remarked, with the light from the kitchen window catching the ring on her finger, "It just makes things more efficient. Imagine what we could do if this place reflected our style. The first real sting wasn't words but tone." At a small dinner party she hosted for colleagues, white tablecloths, tiny portions, a playlist that sounded like a boutique hotel, Emily said, smiling across the table. "Patrick's dad is so sweet, but he's a bit stuck. He likes things the old way." The laughter was polite. I felt it like cold air. I overheard the whisper one night, through the thin stairwell wall, the sound of voices muffled as if through a sheet. I was in the kitchen, wiping the counter, when Emily's voice floated down. "Your father's sweet, but he's stuck in the past. He slows us down." Patrick answered, quieter, embarrassed. "We're trying to move forward." Her words were ordinary, like someone swapping recipes. Ordinary becomes dangerous when it concerns you. I did not confront them that night. I did not yell or throw the sugar jar across the room. Instead, I washed the teapot until the metal shone and set a place at the table like I always had. I told myself that patience is a measure of love. Love had to be patient, I thought. Love had to understand second chances and late payments and the messy aftermath of failed businesses. I believed, for a long time, that patience was the currency of a good father and a good husband. But that whisper lodged itself like a splinter. It was a small thing to anyone else, 2 sentences in the dark. But to me it was the first crack in something I'd thought unbreakable. The house, to them, was a temporary loan. To me, it was a ledger of life, a ledger of our names and dates and the quiet signatures of ordinary days. The whisper taught me that sometimes kindness is mistaken for weakness. It taught me that mercy can be misunderstood as permission. I kept fixing things. The porch railings glowed under my rag. The hedge trimmed itself into an obedient line. I mowed, as if the sound of the mower could reorder the house back into the past. I would stand at the sink and listen, hoping the noise of work would drown the seed of doubt. What I could not know then was how that small, careless sentence would widen into an ache and then a plan. For now it lived between us like a shadow at noon, obvious if you looked for it, but easily ignored if you chose to look away. "You should get that old recliner to the curb," Emily said one morning, standing in the doorway of the living room with a clipboard in her hand like she was inspecting a venue. "It's sentimental, but it takes up space. It doesn't photograph well." I was sitting in that chair, the one with the faded armrest where Margaret used to rest her knitting, and for a moment I forgot the room had changed. The sunlight was thin through the curtains. The clock ticked. I put my cup down carefully and looked at her. "It's been there since 1995, I said. "Margaret used to sit there when she watched the Cardinals. She smiled the way she smiled when she was announcing a color scheme. People don't want memories on their feeds, Henry. They want clean lines. Imagine the Instagram shots, the empty corner with a plant. Less is more. Less is more, I repeated, tasting the words like a foreign coin. Is that what we're calling it now?" Patrick came in behind her, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's right on the look," he said. "We could put a rental ad up for the room and offset some of the bills. You could rent my room?" I asked slowly. The idea felt absurd, like reading a line from someone else's script. Someone responsible, Emily said. A professional. We could get... She threw out a figure, a number like a menu price. $700 a month. That'd cover the cleaning, half the utilities. I stared at the armrest, at the indent where a life had been threaded into fabric. It's not the chair that pays the water bill, I said. She tapped her pen. It's about efficiency. That word, efficiency, became the quiet hammer that shaped the next months. At first, it was small things. Plates replaced, then cups, then a stack of my Sunday newspapers moved to a small, ordered corner with a look of tolerance. Emily rearranged the mantel, sliding out photographs and replacing them with an abstract piece she described as seasonally relevant. I watched her carry Margaret's photograph, the one where she was laughing with her eyes closed, to a cardboard box labeled Donate, and felt my hands grow cold. One afternoon, Grace, my neighbor from 3 doors down, brought over lemon bars and sat at my kitchen table like no one else's business. She was a retired school librarian with a voice like warmed honey and the habit of saying what needed to be said. You don't deserve to live afraid in your own home, Henry, Grace said, handing me a plate. If someone says the wrong thing to you twice, set a boundary. That's what I taught my students, boundaries. I don't want to start a war, I said. I thought we were helping them. You're not their charity case. Sometimes people forget where they came from when they get to the top of the hill. She folded her hands around her cup. You built this place. Don't let them rewrite your name on the deed with comments. I smiled, grateful, but uneasy. Grace was solid where I wavered. Her words lodged like a seed. Dinner parties became a battlefield disguised as hospitality. Emily loved to host. She said it fed her brand, and she loved the small attention a well-placed canapé brought. Her parents came once, a Sunday evening of polite applause and cushioned compliments. Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker were 2 halves of a single opinion. Mrs. Whitaker with her pearls and rehearsed laughter. Mr. Whitaker with his easy handshake and the kind of dad jokes that landed like soft planks. Patrick's father still pays his bills the old-fashioned way, Emily announced at the table with a laugh that sounded professionally timed. He actually mails checks, the Whitakers tittered. A polite clink of glasses. I felt my cheeks warm. It's charming, Mrs. Whitaker said, smiling over at me. There's a kind of romance to paper bills. Charming? Emily sniffed. Or irresponsible. She plucked at her napkin. We're trying to graduate, Dad. We're trying to curate our life. Patrick looked at me as if waiting for a response I might not have been allowed to give. I kept my smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I've always kept things in order, I said quietly. No one's been late on anything. Well, that's the problem, Emily said, folding her fingers under her chin. She let the word hang like a glass sculpture. You pay for things that aren't efficient. We have a budget spreadsheet. You don't. She actually pulled out her phone and swiped through a chart. Here, utilities, groceries, maintenance. We can optimize. Optimizing someone's life, I said, isn't the same as living it. She tossed her head. We're trying to move forward, Henry. Stagnation doesn't scale. The conversational barbs kept coming in small, surgical ways. She criticized the way I hummed when I fixed the sink. It's distracting, she said once. She folded my shirts into drawers incorrectly and righted them with an air of benevolent instruction. Patrick began to apologize to me in private. She doesn't mean it. Dad, she's stressed. But his apologies were brittle, as if made of glass. I started to write things down in a little notebook I kept by the bed. Dates, odd phrases, the times things felt like a bruise. I had a low-grade ache I couldn't name, part betrayal, part grief renewed. The house that had been a map of our life now felt like a place being redrawn without my consent. Then, in the middle of a humid July afternoon, I heard them in the kitchen talking in that quick, conspiratorial tone lovers and partners take when they've decided to build a life together and want to exclude you from the blueprint. We could rent his room, Emily said, voice clipped but casual as if discussing paint. 700, maybe 8. If we staged it right, we could interview people and find someone. Decent, Patrick hesitated. Dad needs somewhere, he said. I don't want to— Listen, Emily said sharply. We're logistics people. We can't sink our money into nostalgia. Her tone was precise enough to slice. It's just business. I stood in the hallway, the wood cool under my palm, and felt the word business land like a verdict. I could have stepped in then, told them this is my home, told them exactly what family looks like. But I didn't. I turned away and went to my workshop, pretending the sound of the saw would mask the sound of my own disappointment. A month later, Patrick's birthday rolled around. Emily had insisted on a small barbecue, intimate, with a few friends and family. I sat on the patio under a string of lights that looked like a set from a film I didn't recognize. People laughed in the warm air, the smell of charcoal and rosemary soft in the night. At one point, Emily leaned across the table with a paper plate in her hand. "Dad," she said, "we still haven't gotten the utilities transferred. It's awkward. We've asked." "I pay every bill," I said, not looking up from the baked potato I was cutting. She smiled, slow and clinical. "Exactly the problem." The words were a punch that didn't sting at first, then opened into something hot and raw. I felt all the small slights, the donated chair, the replaced photos, the whispered plans, fold together into a single motion. "Exactly the problem," I echoed, tasting the syllables. I set my fork down carefully. "So what, I'm a problem?" "You're not modern," she said. "You're an anachronism. You keep the past." "And what is the future then?" I asked. My voice was steady, and that steadiness, I noticed, made people look up. "The future pays for itself," Emily said. "It has a budget." Patrick shifted in his seat, looking as though he wanted the earth, or the barbecue, to open up. "Dad, let's not— Not what?" I asked. "Not tell the truth?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "You're being dramatic." I stood up. The sudden movement made a few people turn. The string lights shimmered. The air was humid against my skin. "You know what drama is," I said. "Drama is tearing a photograph out of its frame and putting it in a box while the person in the photo is still a part of your life. Drama is calling your father sweet in front of company like he's an exhibit." No one said anything. The sound of the grill popped. A dog barked down the street. Later that week, after a slow, stubborn sulk that I tried to call dignity, I went to bed and, in the morning, found my bedroom door locked. The key, the brass key that had hung on the peg by the kitchen, was gone. I tried the knob until my hand ached. I walked out to the garage under the porch light, and there they were, boxes stacked in a neat, unfeeling tower. My clothes folded into plastic, my records wrapped in newspaper. Margaret's shawl with a corner torn, tucked into a box labeled garage sale. In the dim garage light, the smell of cardboard and damp insulation hung heavy. A framed wedding photograph lay half-cracked on top of the boxes. Margaret's face stared up at the ceiling as if searching for the sky she used to hum under. I sat down on an overturned crate. Breath slow, calm, and a small laugh escaped me. Not from humor, but from the absurdity of the scene. The house was being repurposed like an old warehouse. My life had been packed into labeled containers. "So that's what family looks like now," I whispered to the cardboard. The cracked photograph, the rain beginning to pat the roof in a soft, relentless rhythm. The whisper stayed in the garage with me, the sound of it tiny and finer. A week after the garage night, the postman left a thick envelope on the hall table with the legal firm's return address pressed on the corner. Barnes & Cooper, attorneys at law, Burlington County. My first thought was a tax notice. My second, an invitation to some real estate seminar. I didn't expect the familiar weight of paper to sound like a small, tumbling stone. Inside was a letter and a single photocopy, folded with the care a stranger takes with someone else's memory. The letterhead smelled faintly of toner and lemon polish. My hands felt cold as I read the name typed across the top. Mr. Henry Marshall, former homeowner. The word former made the room tilt, small and sudden. I called the number and made an appointment out of habit rather than hope. The reception area at Barnes & Cooper was neat in a way I recognized. Oak chairs, magazines neatly fanned, a bowl of mints. A ceiling light hummed. Richard Barnes came out himself, tall and gray at the temples, the kind of lawyer who wore the same measured smile for everyone. "Mr. Marshall?" "I'm Richard Barnes." He extended his hand. His grip was firm but not crushing. "Please have a seat." "Thank you," I said. My voice had the thin edge of sleep. The waiting room clock ticked like a metronome for everything that felt uncertain. Richard led me into a small office lined with shelves of bound volumes and framed diplomas. He closed the door with the soft click of a man who's practiced doing difficult things nicely. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of this," he began, sliding a file across the desk. "We represent the Whittaker family for certain matters, and this came to our attention when they requested confirmation of title for lending purposes. There's a matter regarding the deed to your property on Maple Drive." I felt my pulse under my collar. "The deed?" "According to county records, the title was transferred on April 3rd of last year to Patrick Marshall and Emily Whittaker Marshall." He tapped the photocopy. "The copy attached is the recorded instrument. The signature on the transfer appears to be yours." I stared at the sheet until the letters smeared into shapes. The signature looked like my own hand, the flourished H, the long tail on the R. But it was the wrong color of ink, the slant slightly off. "This can't be right," I said, each word measured. "I didn't sign anything transferring my home." Richard's face softened. "That's precisely why I asked to see you. Mr. Marshall, the signature on file is matched to one we have in their submission. The registrar shows it was notarized and recorded. These are the dates and stamps." He slid a copy of the county clerk's stamp across the desk. "A blue ink circle, recorded, 04/07/2024, Book 318, page 402, notarized." I repeated. The memory came then, a small, insignificant moment. Patrick handing me a clipboard a year and a half earlier, saying, "Just a quick signature, Dad. Home insurance update." I had signed in the kitchen with a pen that wasn't mine, the radio on low, Margaret's photograph catching the light. I remembered thinking it was odd to update insurance in June, but I'd trusted him. "Habit, maybe. Trust, certainly." Richard folded his hands. "We can pursue this in several ways. If the signature is forged, or if your consent was obtained by misrepresentation, that could invalidate the transfer. We can subpoena bank records, notarization acknowledgments, even call the notary public. There are procedural routes, but they can be lengthy and public." I wanted to ask how you wished to proceed. I kept my face calm. "How long would it take if we chose to challenge?" I asked, trying to sound practical, as if discussing a plumbing repair. "A contested, quiet title action could take months, possibly longer if the defendants contest. There may be criminal implications if a forgery is proven, but that's for the district attorney's office to decide. Frankly, Mr. Marshall, your son and daughter-in-law could contest it. Litigation is hard on families." He said the last word softly, with a careful look that suggested he knew what litigation did to the people whose names were on the paperwork. "So, what you're saying," I said slowly, "is that there's paperwork showing my signature, but it may not be my signature in truth." My hands found the arm of the chair. The wood was smooth under my palm, familiar and strangely consoling. "That's right," Richard said. "We need to examine the ink, the handwriting, the notary's files. There are also alternatives: negotiation, a mediated settlement, or even an agreed repurchase if the parties are amenable." I thought of Emily's voice on the stairs. Pay rent or sleep in the street. She had spoken like someone cataloging options, as if home were a ledger. Now sitting in that office with the faint lemon of law firm polish around me, the ledger felt heavier and colder than I'd imagined. Did you speak to them?" I asked. My throat was dry. "I sent a standard request for confirmation," Richard said. "They replied that the transfer was legitimate and that they believed all acts were authorized. They provided copies of the recorded instrument and the signed transfer. That's why I wanted you here, to make sure you were aware and to discuss your wishes before we proceeded." Outside, a bus hissed past, breaking the spell. I remembered the day Patrick hugged me in the doorway, the way his shoulder had pressed against mine with the familiar ease of a boy returning from a long day. I had trusted that hug to mean something. I had taken his word without checking the receipt. "Does the document show any consideration?" I asked, a lawyer's word Richard used like a blunt instrument. "Money." "Was money paid for the transfer?" Richard rifled through the folder and handed me a photocopy of the declaration page. It lists the consideration as love and affection, he said with a small, ironic half-smile. Which is fairly common when transfers are between family members, but it isn't always dispositive. Love and affection, I repeated, tasting the phrase until it turned thin and brittle. They put the house into their names in April last year and called it Love and Affection? They did. Richard's eyes were even. If you believe you were misled, or that the signature is not yours, I can begin an inquiry immediately. But I should tell you that going after this will likely make the matter public. There will be depositions. There will be questions. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The room's silence folded around me. Paper rustled like distant rain. Somewhere down the hall, a phone clicked. The lawyer's careful voice kept ticking off options like a metronome. I thought of the photograph in the box, my wedding day with Margaret, her hand in mine, the sun catching the old oak behind us. I had never imagined anyone would fold that into business. I don't want humiliation, I said finally. If there's a way to fix it quietly, to return what is mine, I'd prefer that. Richard nodded. That's reasonable. We can send a demand letter, request rescission, and seek an amicable resolution before filing suit. If they cooperate, we avoid court. If not, we proceed. I reached into my pocket and found the small notebook I'd begun keeping, the one with dates and small grievances. I slid it across the desk. I have a note of the day Patrick asked me to sign an insurance form, June 12th, 2023. Not that that proves anything, but it's there. Richard opened the book and read the line quietly. Thank you. That helps. We'll also pull the county's recorded instruments and the notary's affidavit. I'll need your authorization to proceed. I signed the release without drama. My signature looked small and certain on the paper, the ink fresh and dark. It felt in that instant like placing a new brick on a wall I had thought crumbled. On the drive home, rain stitched the windshield into a moving, watery screen. The house on Maple Drive sat under its usual halo of streetlight. From the road it looked the same as it always had, stoic and quiet. Inside, however, the air had shifted. There was a line now, a bright, thin line drawn through the day I had thought was ordinary. That evening, I sat in the living room with the deed spread like a map on my knees. The radio was low. Upstairs I could hear the soft clink of glasses and the murmur of their laughter. Emily's words returned to me, pay rent or sleep in the street. The irony was sharp enough to make me breathe shallowly. I folded the photocopy carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept Margaret's letters. There was a clarity then that felt both cold and steady. Pain had edged toward a different feeling, not yet action, but something like intent. I'll handle this quietly. Mr. Barnes, I had told the lawyer earlier, and the words sat with me now not as an avoidance but as a promise. Quiet could be a tool. Patience could be preparation. The calm I'd practiced for so long began to change its purpose, from surviving humiliation to rectifying it. I looked up toward the stairs, listening to the faint laughter, the soft scrape of a chair. The house hummed with life that was not mine, not yet. I allowed myself a short, careful breath, and in that breath, the first small part of the plan took shape. I sat across from Richard Barnes in his office and listened to him list the possible paths like a doctor explaining treatment options. His voice was calm and practiced. We can file a quiet title action, petition the court to declare the transfer void, he said. If the signature is forged, there are potential criminal referrals to the district attorney. Alternatively, you can pursue a negotiated rescission, demand a return of title, perhaps with some assurances, or we can explore selling the property under your name to cut the cord cleanly. Litigation will be public and slow. Negotiation can be discreet, but depends on their cooperation. Discreet, I repeated. The word settled between us. Richard met my eyes. Confidentiality? I can work on that. We can issue demand letters under the firm's letterhead, request mediation, and keep matters out of the public record as much as possible. But if they refuse, there are limits. I don't want headlines, I said. I don't want our neighbor's eyebrows raised. I paused, searching for the right word. Resolution. Quiet. That's reasonable. He pushed a legal pad toward me. Sign here to authorize us to obtain the recorded instruments, the notary's file, and to send a demand for rescission. I'll also draft a confidentiality request. I signed. The ink dried fast and steady, a small, certain anchor. "One more point," Richard said, leaning back. "If you do want to sell, list under your legal name, Henry Marshall. Because as of county records, until the transfer is set aside, they appear as owners. But if we can show the transfer is voidable," he shrugged in that way lawyers do, "I can prepare an affidavit to clear title prior to closing, or structure an escrow to protect proceeds." "I want options," I said. "If there is a way to keep this private and fix it, that's the first path. If they refuse, I want the house to leave with dignity, not with me waiting to be shoved out." Richard nodded. "Understood. I'll proceed on the confidentiality route and the demand letter. Simultaneously, if you want, start a conversation with a real estate professional so you have an exit strategy that's not impulsive." I called Sandra Myers that afternoon. Her voice was brisk over the phone, practical and efficient, the exact opposite of the kitchen table negotiations Emily favored. "Sandra, I need your discretion," I said. "I want to list the house. Price it fairly but competitively. I want an agent's reach, not a parade." "A listing under your name?" she asked. "That can be done, Henry, but legally we should make sure the chain of title is clear. I'm familiar with Burlington County. We can do a quick marketing push. If you're willing to stage minimally, we'll attract investors who can close fast." "I want someone who'll close within a few weeks if possible," I said. "We'll need the proceeds protected until Richard clears the title." "Escrow," she said. "We'll use a short escrow with a reputable title company." "I'll coordinate with Richard. Don't worry. I've handled delicate sales like this." There was no indulgence in her voice, only competence. A week later, with Richard having sent the demand letter and received a curt, non-committal reply, Sandra had staged the living room lightly. A neutral rug, a modern lamp. Margaret's photograph returned to the mantel in a way that looked intentional. She'd priced the house at a figure that turned heads. Competitive, under market to ensure a quick sale. The market, in a way that surprised me, responded. An investor couple from the city made an all-cash offer within days. "You'll close in 2 weeks if you accept their offer, and the title company clears preliminary conditions," Sandra said as she put the offer on the table. "It's fast, it's clean, and we'll place the proceeds in escrow pending resolution of the title issue. You okay with that?" I looked at the figure, a number that made my chest tighten and then loosen in the same beat. Money was never the point, but it was a tool. "Do it," I said. The evening I decided to tell them, I folded my napkin with slow, deliberate hands and set it on the table like one sets down an important book. The chandelier cast a soft pool of light. Outside, thunder rumbled low and patient. The weather matched whatever this was going to be. "I've decided to sell the house," I said, plain and steady. Emily laughed, the same sharp thing she used when she thought I was making a quaint jest. "Oh, Henry, you're joking, right? You can't sell what you don't own, oh?" I replied quietly. "That's what I wanted to talk about." I slid the certified report from Richard across the table. The paper had the county clerk's stamp, the notary's affidavit, and Richard's typed note. "Transfer executed without verified consent." "Document in need of rescission." Emily's smirk faltered the way a candle does when someone breathes too close. Patrick's fork clicked on his plate. The room tightened, a watch being wound. "Dad, it was just a formality," Patrick said, voice thin. I thought you knew." "You asked me to sign an insurance update, Patrick," I said. "I didn't ask you to change my name on the deed." Patrick's face went pale. I thought you wanted help with taxes, with paperwork. You always said to trust me with these things." "You said I was old-fashioned," Emily said, anger threading her words. "You mocked our budgets." "You said I was stuck in the past," I said. The nerve of it, their casual erasure of my life, made the letters in the air feel sharp. "You told me to pay rent or sleep in the street," Emily's breath hitched. "That wasn't—" "It was," I said. "You said it on the stairs. I remember every word." "You can't just do this, Henry," she said, the panic behind her attempt at composure breaking through. "You can't kick us out?" "You did that already," I said softly. "You just didn't expect me to walk away first." Silence sat like a third person at the table. The thunder moved closer. The lights blinked. Emily's hand trembled where it gripped her wine glass. The crystal chimed in a tiny high note. "What are you going to do?" Patrick asked. He sounded suddenly like my son again, frightened and small. "I sold the house," I said, "to new owners who will take possession when the transaction closes. The proceeds will be held in escrow pending resolution of the title. Richard is handling the confidential demand for rescission. I gave him the authority to proceed legally if needed." Emily's laugh this time was a broken thing. "You can't do that legally. This is fraud." Her voice rose in a way that attracted the neighbors' attention through the windows. "It looks like fraud on the face of it," I said. "That's why Richard is involved. But in the meantime, I chose dignity." "You sold the house without talking to us?" Patrick said, hurt sharp in his words. "Dad, you could have—" "I tried to keep this private," I said. "I asked for confidentiality. I asked Richard to mediate. You returned a curt note. So I took steps to protect myself and the memory of Margaret. Quick sale, safe escrow, and a path forward without public courtrooms." Emily shoved her chair back. "You are being vindictive." "No." I stood, the chair scraping softly. "I am being practical." I felt a calm I hadn't felt in months, a quiet like the cold before dawn. "You made choices. I made one too." They left that night, not quietly. Their voices carried across the wet driveway as they packed a few boxes. I made no move to stop them. The next morning, the new owners, two quiet professionals with earnest voices, arrived with a closing agent and a title company representative. The paperwork moved like a slow, relentless tide. Signatures, notary stamps, a certified check scanned, funds placed in escrow as agreed. Within 2 weeks, the sale closed. The closing statement listed the purchase price, closing costs, and the escrow hold for the title dispute. The title company issued a preliminary notice, ownership transfer recorded, occupancy to be negotiated with the seller, me. A week after closing, the new owners sent an official eviction notice to Emily and Patrick. It was formal, polite, and decisive. "Where are we supposed to go?" Emily screamed on the driveway that afternoon, voice ricocheting between the houses. Her hair was wet from rain, mascara running like small tributaries down her cheeks. I turned to the street where the neighbors had gathered at their porches, umbrellas open like witness flags. The thunder had moved on. The sky was washed clean. I folded my hands behind my back, feeling the small panic in the neighborhood like an audience leaning forward. "Maybe somewhere you can learn what home really means," I said. And my voice was as steady as the oak that shaded the front yard. Her scream broke into a ragged sob. Patrick reached out as if to pull her back, but she shook him off. They gathered what they could and left, not with dignity, but with a rawness that was its own kind of lesson. I closed the front door and stood on the porch while rain began again, soft and steady. The house looked the same as it had every morning when Margaret and I took coffee on the stoop. But I knew it wasn't the same. The signature on that deed had been a wound. What I had done was not revenge. It was a reclamation of memory, of self-respect, and of the dignity one keeps when others forget they once owed it. They left with a U-Haul and hard faces. The neighborhood watched like it was a slow parade. I watched them go from the kitchen window and let the blinds fall back into place until the light was thin and private. The new owners had been courteous, papers signed, keys exchanged, a handshake that felt like a neat stitch across a wound, so the house looked, for all the world, untroubled. Inside, cardboard sat in small stacks where their boxes had been. The mantel was bare where Emily had once staged seasonal art. A week after the closing, I received a brief email from Sandra. Tenants relocated. Eviction executed per new owner. Please let me know if you need anything regarding the cottage. I folded the message and carried it to the table like a small, useful thing. Patrick called that afternoon. The phone lit my name and his number. I watched the screen for a long time, the way a man watches a weather report when a storm can still be avoided. "Dad?" he said when I picked up. His voice had that familiar closeness, no longer confident but not yet repentant. "I'm sorry, I didn't think you could have talked to me," I said. The words were even though a part of me felt like wood under a chisel. "I know. I messed up. We're in a rental now. It's small, but it'll do." "Emily, he swallowed. "She's upset." Can we talk? I'm finalizing the lease on a small place by Lake Harrow," I said. "It's quiet. Minimal maintenance. I'll be nearby." A pause. You're okay? I will be, I said. You do what you need to do. I didn't say I'd been up half the night signing the new lease, measuring curtains against sunlight, picking the room that would be mine. I didn't say I'd sat with the keys to the little cottage and felt suddenly young and free in a way grief and time had never let me be. I'll come by, he said after a moment. I want to see you. You can, I told him. It felt right to leave the branch of the invitation extended but steady. He thanked me, quiet and awkward, the way young men say grace when they are learning it for the first time. Grace came over the next afternoon with a quilt folded over her arm and 2 containers of chicken soup still steaming. She set them on the counter and peered around the living room like a woman taking stock of a small battlefield. You did what you had to, Henry, she said, not waiting for preamble. Her words landed like a soft hand. No, I replied quietly, taking the spoon she offered. I did what they taught me, what Margaret taught me. Stand up when respect runs out. I watched the steam curl from the bowl and felt something settle in my chest. Grace sat down and folded her hands around the quilt. It's funny, isn't it? You keep being the same man and the rest of the world keeps changing its definitions. She smiled, slow and steady. You kept your dignity. That's rare. The week faded into a small routine of boxes and phone calls. Emily left messages at odd hours, sharp half-apologies, angry fragments. I didn't answer most of them. She called me once, and when I let it go to voicemail, I could hear her, breathless and pleading. Dad, please, she said. We can work this out. You don't have to sell the house. Her voice cracked. The message ended in a soft, wet sound I recognized from my own younger life. The sound of someone finally seeing consequence. Richard phoned with the formalities a man of law must make. We closed the inquiry, he said pragmatically. County handwriting experts compared samples. Not much in the way of criminal indictment, without clearer evidence of intent. You requested we not pursue charges, Mr. Marshall. That was your decision. I did, I said. I could hear the rain gather outside, drumming on the eaves like a steady proofreading of my choices. I wanted restoration, not revenge. There are no active charges, he replied. I filed our civil demand for rescission, and they negotiated an exit. The title company holds the escrow. For all intents, the sale is complete and the proceeds are protected pending any later claims. He paused. Are you comfortable with how we resolved this? Yes. The single word felt heavier than it had any right to be. Thank you, Richard. For discretion, happy to help, he said. If you need anything else, call. After I hung up, I walked through the empty rooms. The house carried sounds like footprints, the faint squeak of a step-worn stair, the hollow echo of a cabinet closing. It was the sort of silence that contains both loss and permission. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter where Margaret used to chop lemons, feeling the worn edge polished by decades of use. The surface was still warm from sunlight. We built it well, didn't we, Margaret? I whispered to the air, to the photograph in the drawer, to the space that belonged to both memory and facts. The house answered with a hollow echo and the soft shuffle of someone else's box being stacked in another town. There was a small ceremony in my mind, no fanfare, just a looping recollection of times that made the place a ledger of our life. The oven door that stuck in winter because we'd never fixed it. The blue chip mug she always kept for Sundays. The notch in the banister where Patrick once carved his initials as a boy. I touched each as if to read Braille. Neighbor after neighbor came by, some with casseroles, some with a look that carried 2 parts curiosity to 1 part sympathy. Mrs. Patel from across the street brought scones and a thermos of tea. It is done now, she said, patting my hand. You did not make trouble. You made a choice. At night, I packed the last of my belongings into a single, sensible suitcase. The lease for the lakeside cottage required first month and deposit, references, and a signature. The landlord, a retired schoolteacher named Diane, met me at the gate and handed over a neat set of keys. She smiled like someone who knew the quiet of second acts. You'll like the view from the back porch, she said. Mornings are kind. She leaned in, conspiratorial. There's a bench under the old willow. Bring a thermos. I moved in with a few boxes and Margaret's shawl on my shoulders. The cottage seemed to understand me immediately. The walls were modest, the floorboards creaked in comfortable places, and the lake reflected the sky like a clean sheet. I made tea and sat on the back porch while dusk settled. The air smelled of water and earth, of possibility. That night, I slept with less ache than I had in months. Not because the loss no longer existed, but because I had chosen the terms of my departure. There is a difference between being forced out and leaving with your head held even a little. That difference is where dignity lives. The for sale sign at Maple Drive had already been changed to sold weeks before. I drove by once and saw the new owners arranging furniture through the window, their silhouettes small and intimate in the afternoon light. I felt nothing like triumph. I felt, instead, a slow, unfurling relief, like a bandage finally taken off. I thought about Patrick sometimes, his calls, his half-apologies, and about the lesson they would learn in the way only life can teach, not through lectures or shame, but through the slow economics of consequence. For my part, I had what I wanted, a small place by the water, Grace's lemon bars, a stack of Margaret's letters in the drawer, and a sense that the worst indignity had been answered not by noise but by measured action. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone who has wronged you is to let the world arrange its own justice while you make yourself whole. I stirred my tea and watched the lake take the last light. Months passed like slow weather. I found a rhythm at the cottage by Lake Harrow that felt less like retreat and more like the resumption of things I had misplaced. Mornings began with the same small rites Margaret and I had practiced for decades. A pot of tea warmed on the stove, the newspaper folded in two, and a moment on the back porch to watch the water. The lake shimmered the way an old coin shivers in the palm, silver light punctuated by the ripple of a breeze. I kept a small garden behind the cottage. Tomatoes mostly, a stubborn rosemary bush, and a row of marigolds Margaret would have liked for the color. My hands learned the language of soil again, the whisper of dirt between fingers, the faint tang of fertilizer, the cool of early morning dew that collected like breath on the plants. It was honest work. You plant, you water, you wait. It taught me patience in the way grief had not. On nights when the wind pressed in from the water and the windows rattled just so, I wrote letters. I wrote to no one in particular, notes that began with Dear Margaret and scrawled off into pages that smelled faintly of tea. There were lists, memories, and admissions, the small apologies I'd never given, and the things I promised myself I would keep. They were private things, folded and tucked into a drawer beside the bed. They were the slow stitching back together of a life. One afternoon, the screen door creaked, and Patrick stood on the path, holding a tiny bundle with a shawl draped over it. He looked smaller than the boy who had once carved his initials into the banister at Maple Drive. Fatherhood had made him both cautious and immediate in ways that softened the old angles of his face. "Dad," he said, voice low, as if the cabin's calm required it. "Can I?" He handed me the child. She fit into my arms like a small, warm promise, a tuft of dark hair, a button nose, a mouth that pursed when she slept. Breath hot and sweet against my wrist. I felt something in my chest rearrange, an old ache replaced by a new, gentle weight. "You were right, Dad," Patrick said after a long minute. His eyes were wet at the corners. "We lost more than a house. We lost, I don't know. We lost the simple things. I'm sorry." I held the child and let her settle. Her fingers curled around mine with the trust only a baby knows. "Maybe it wasn't a loss after all," I said. My voice was softer than I expected. "The present burst in me then, sudden, bright. She is here. The world goes on." The child let out a small sound and opened her eyes, dark and astonished, as if meeting the world for the first time. Patrick sat on the porch step and folded his hands. I thought we were doing what was best. I thought efficiency was a kind of honesty. "I didn't see that we were erasing things, you learn," I said. "Sometimes the lesson is painful." He nodded, swallowing. "Do you forgive me?" I looked at the baby's face, at the small, perfect trust in her glance. Forgiveness is not a single action. It was a slow easing, an acceptance that the past is a place for learning, not for perpetual punishment. "Yes," I said simply. "I forgive you, but I hope you remember what a home really is." He exhaled, a sound like relief and regret braided together. "I will. I promise." We sat in the quiet that follows confession. Not dramatic, just the hush of two men and a child learning how to be the family they had been promised to be. The light fell across the lake, amber and forgiving. I felt how small and stubborn and perfectly ordinary the healing was. Later, I placed a framed photograph of Margaret on the windowsill by the kitchen sink, the same photograph that had been boxed and nearly forgotten. She looked younger in the picture, sunlight in her hair, the hint of a laugh at the corner of her mouth. I set the frame where the morning light would touch it first, and the memory in the glass seemed to sip the light like tea. Rain began then. At first a fine feather against the window, and then a steady tapping that counted time in soft beats. I listened to it as I washed a cup, feeling the warmth of the water and the small domestic satisfaction of a task completed. Outside, the lake blurred under the falling sky, and the garden leaned into the weather as if relieved to be watered. Some time later, when the house on Maple Drive came into my thoughts, which it did often, like a well-thumbed page, I would remember the way quiet had worked for me. It was not a thunderclap of revenge. It was a series of careful, unshowy choices that returned a measure of dignity. They had learned something, perhaps, in the loss, a curriculum of humility that no budget could buy. I set the photograph of Margaret in the sunlight and stepped back. The rain rattled the panes, and the small sound felt like punctuation to a long sentence. Sometimes the quietest victories are the loudest truths.